Welcome to the 48th episode of Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast. This is David Helvarg, and our co-host with the most, as always, is Vicki Nichols-Goldstein. Happy birthday, Vicki.
Thank you so much, and it's great being here, as always.
Today we're talking with Dr. Brian Tissot, a surfer, writer, professional marine ecologist, and for 7 years the director of the Humboldt State University's Marine Lab in Trinidad. That's a fishing town in Northern California, almost 300 miles north of San Francisco. There are over 150 marine labs just in the United States, training the next generation of marine scientists. Before Humboldt State, Brian worked at the University of Hawaii and Washington State University. Along with studying coral reefs and other habitats now at risk, he's also had a front row seat to the recent decline of Northern California's kelp forests. When not doing his research off of boats or in tiny submarines, Brian also finds time to surf and recently wrote his first science fiction novel, Songs of Thalassa. So, Brian, let's start with an important question. What's it like to go from surfing the warm waters of Hawaii to the frigid seas of Northern California?
It's quite a shock, and it's pretty difficult to do for me these days. I actually grew up surfing in California, so I'm used to cold water. But, once you get used to that tropical clear water, it's tough. Hawaii is such an idyllic place for surfing, but yeah, I still do it. California is worth it. There's some great waves here, and it's my home state. So, I've always loved the ocean, and my dad was a naval aviator, so we moved every 2.5 years. And, even though we went to the West Coast and different places, East Coast, different places, we mostly keep coming back to California, and I was always near the water. So we always went to the beach. My mom was an avid beach goer. And I just made that connection really early that I just loved the ocean and walking in and swimming. And she wouldn't let me surf till I was 13, so I had to wait, and that was 1970. And from there, it was no turning back. It was literally at least the first 2 decades, that was my life, everything, until marine biology just came, naturally, I think, once you're in the water and you're interacting and you see the marine life. And So that was a big inspiration for me to become a marine biologist, my love for the ocean.
I started surfing, I think I was 13, and so I totally get that. But in reading more about you, Brian, you indicated that you were very influenced by your parents and that you were primarily raised by your mom because your dad traveled so much. How did she really influence you? You just seem to be so heartfelt connected with her.
Yeah, well, she was a very soulful woman and a very wise woman, and she just encouraged me to think big and dream and go after things. You may not get them, but if you don't try, you're never going to know. And so she always pushed me to do something that made a difference in the world, and that's really what my whole life has been about. And my dad was gone most of the time, but he was also just a huge icon and a leader. He retired as a rear admiral. At one point he was the captain of the USS Enterprise, and I got to ride the ship back when I was 15 from Hawaii to San Francisco, which is an incredible experience. So all of that kind of coalesced to really motivate me to make a difference in the world. The military contributions, my mom's contributions, and then being near the water. And so they were a huge inspiration.
It was that sense of service from the military and yet that love of the ocean. And So you went to college thinking marine biology?
Well, to be honest, when I graduated from high school, I wasn't really that excited about college. But I ended up going to Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo because the waves were so good. That's honestly why I went there. That was the place I picked. But, I started surfing, and after a year or so, the story is actually the marine biology professor for Cal Poly picked me up hitchhiking and told me just to take his classes because I didn't have the prerequisites, and that's really just what changed my life. An incident like that, and then I never turned back. Well, it goes with what we were just talking about, and thanks for asking that. After I would surf, I would just hang out at the beach like most people and kind of wait for the wind to die down. And the abalone where I lived near San Luis Obispo were all over the place. And so I started exploring them and looking at them. I was fascinated. And that was really my first hook into science. And so I did a bunch of projects as an undergraduate. My master's thesis was on abalone, and most of my dissertation was on abalone. And, part of that was, as you may know, black abalone are on the endangered species list right now. And that's because back in the 80s, in the middle of my dissertation, they just started dying. And that's one of the things that really pushed me into conservation biology and trying to preserve them. And now I'm on the recovery team trying to, figure out how we can bring them back. But that was my early inspiration into science. And I love them. They're just great, fascinating animals, and kind of a hook to what's exciting about marine biology.
We did an earlier show on the recovery of the white abalone and the scientist who's working on that. So you went to the University of Hawaii, was your first teaching gig?
Right. After I got my PhD at Oregon State, I was so lucky to get a job in University of Hawaii in Hilo, which I really loved. It was a fantastic place. And, it's a marine biologist and surfer's dream. I couldn't believe I'd done that. And it was wonderful. The people there are so fantastic. I love teaching to the diverse audiences, and I learned so much from my students, many of which I'm still in touch with today. And some of them have gone on to fantastic careers, including a few Native Hawaiians and some Pacific Islanders and people that I really had the pleasure of having in my classroom. It's a fantastic place. But it also started my research on coral reefs, which continues to this day.
Recent studies say 50% of the coral reefs have died since I was born, and 14% just in the last decade. So you started studying coral, and you were seeing what?
Well, when I first started studying coral reefs in Hawaii, they were really in good shape, and except for human impacts in some places. And that was what we really focused on early on, primarily the aquarium trade. But, early on, there was also some issues around boat moorings where they were throwing anchors in the corals. And in West Hawaii, where I work, mostly Kona Coast, those were addressed. And we've been doing research on primarily the aquarium trade for almost 30 years, as really trying to help get that to a sustainable fishery.
Aquarium trade is where people are taking tropical fish out of the wild and selling it to people who collect saltwater aquariums.
Right. When you buy those fish in Petco, especially yellow tangs, those are often from Hawaii, and they're live caught off of coral reefs. And a lot of people don't know freshwater fish are mostly cultured, so it's not much of an issue, but these are, directly impacting reefs. So we looked at that. We published actually over 30 papers on the aquarium trade alone. And really, I think, helped make a difference for how we understand and manage that. But the corals were all pretty decent for most parts until about the 90s, when we started having these bleaching events. And, it was just tragic to go swimming out on a reef when you see all these white coral heads kind of popped up. That was in 96, and they did recover a lot from that. But then we've had the events are becoming more frequent. They're becoming more severe. And this is in Hawaii, which is not super tropical, right? It's about 20 degrees north. So it's fairly kind of, subtropical, but yet we're still seeing it. And of course, it's happening globally, and it's just really tragic. And because it's tied to global warming and climate change and ocean acidification, things that we really aren't addressing well on the planet, as both of you well know.
Right, and warming waters is what drives the bleaching.
Right. Yeah, they just can't handle over a certain temperature their symbiotic algae, the ones that really provide nutrients for them because they live off of sunlight, because corals are animals, right, which also eat. But when they abandon the coral, when it gets too warm, the coral loses a big part of its nutrition. And over time, if that doesn't reverse quickly, and it hasn't been, they simply die.
Right, and the symbiotic algae also are colorful, so that gives the coral colors. So it's basically their white bones that are exposed then. You
got it. That's right. And, sometimes it gets recolonized, sometimes it doesn't. And, but the frequency is what's really, is scary. These heat waves that are coming in and moving all over the country, which we really didn't understand even 10 years ago, are, quite frightening in terms of their impact to not just coral reefs, but kelp forests and polar seas and all sorts of ecosystems.
Yeah, and it's not just the country, too. It's really the whole world.
Absolutely.
Reefs around the world.
And that was my next question is these warming waters are not just evenly warming around the planet. There are actually these marine heat waves. And when you got to Northern California, we've had the recent warm blob, they called it. Maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, when I first moved here to Humboldt, that was in 2013. It was, a really great kelp forest and everything was in good shape. But literally the next year we had that event, and that just tells you how we understood heat waves. We didn't know what it was, so NOAA called it the blob, and it was one of the early heat waves on the West Coast, and it really devastated the Northern California kelp forests, which are mostly bull kelp. It's different than a lot of other California where you have giant kelp, which is a perennial. Bull kelp comes in every year and grows, and it's really sensitive to, it needs nutrients. It's one of the fastest growing plants in the world. It can grow a foot a day, and sometimes even more. And so without those nutrients, which is what comes in with cold water, the warm water environment, it just fell apart. And then urchins, which normally are kind of happy because they're being fed, they come out, they're looking for more food, and they kind of mowed down everything else. And that was on top of the sea stars, which are one of their main predators. The sunflower stars up here had died from mass mortality in 2013, as you may know, the whole sea star wasting disease.
Right. So the sea stars predate on the urchin. So this is how you had the urchin explosion. The sea stars died from a virus that scientists in Southern California said was supercharged by the warming water. So it's a feedback loop.
So all of these things are related to climate change, and they're coming together in ways we never thought about. And that's what's very difficult to know what to do.
Yeah, it seems like there's always something tragic that is happening. And with that, I want to just talk a little bit about your research with bottom trawling and what you have been able to understand and really experience with your research. Can you talk about that and how that is attached to essential fish habitat?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's very similar to the kelp forest situation in that we're causing a lot of destruction from our activities to the seafloor through trawling, which was a very predominant feature of fisheries, mostly in the 1990s and early 2000s. As you may know, the NOAA declared rockfish, which is the primarily fish that's trawled, a failure in the year 2000, and they had to rebuild the stocks. And one of the things was they didn't understand what they were doing to the seafloor. They don't see it. So I was fortunate enough in the late 80s and early 2000s to go out with Mark Hickson and a few other great scientists, and we actually did videotapes of these areas, both where they had trawled and where they hadn't trawled, and of course the difference was stark. It was literally like an old growth redwood forest versus a grassy plain with stumps. And it just, that's what trawling does. It's very destructive. It's very generalized. You get a lot of bycatch. And they were destroying a lot of these really important habitats. And so over time, working with the other groups, mostly Oceana and EcoTrust and Pew Oceans, they helped pioneer some plans that were adopted by the Fishery Council to protect some of these habitats. And that's really ultimately what we ended up doing. So some places are now off limits because we understand these are places you want to protect, but they still are trawling in quite a few areas. And mud areas are a lot more resilient to those kinds of things. So that's kind of what we've learned and where it's gone since then. But
talk about what you do at a marine lab in terms of how you get out there and discover these situations.
Well, Marine Lab, and you said there's a whole bunch of them. There's more than several dozen across the West Coast alone. Great hubs for activity. So, our HSU, which is a relatively small university, we have a full-on lab, which has a wet lab where you can raise and culture animals and learn a lot of science about that. We also have a lot of boats to get in the water. You mentioned the Coral Sea. That's our 90-foot research vessel. We can take that out with an ROV and go down underwater and, do all sorts of studies about trawling. Right now, we're gearing up for a lot of studies on wind energy, which is coming into Humboldt. And then we have smaller boats, mostly like Boston whalers and things that we use for scuba diving. And that's how we get out to the North Coast kelp forest. And so the lab is really kind of a hub of marine infrastructure that allows the students primarily, because they do most of the work. I mean, I get a grant, but they're the ones that go out and do it. And to go out and do all these different habitats that we talked about, the shore, reefs, kelp forests. It's just fantastic and a great place to learn. And we're also making huge discoveries that are really important.
There's a picture of you in the lab brochure in a little looking like homemade submarine. Tell us what that was.
There's a lot of small kind of hobby subs that are coming out now, which you can actually buy and build kits, right? And so we have some of those where we have actually done that. And what's great is the students can be involved, and then you go out and you kind of demonstrate what it's like off of a dock or a pier, and take videotapes and things and show them. And of course, the big ones, and Vicki knows this really well, those are big and they involve a lot of people, and you have to have expertise to operate those. And we do have 2 ROVs at HSU that we use regularly. So the labs really open up a huge opportunity. And they're networked across the entire West Coast. So people move around and they go to different places depending on what they're studying.
Mm-hmm. But you've also been in a manned submersible. And what was that like?
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, I've had the pleasure. This was the Delta, which is basically in 1988, the first time I went out with that was Hecate Bank, Oregon, where we did a lot of this early trawling studies. And then up until the marine protected areas were established in California, I was fortunate to work with Mary Yakovich, the NOAA, Rick Starr at Moss Landing, and do a lot of diving on the marine protected areas right when they were being established. So then we can see how, fish and vertebrates and other things have responded to these kinds of levels of protection. In fact, I'm part of a big group now of deep sea scientists, and we just are publishing kind of a review of all the data from all the MPAs that have been done. And this is Cal Fish and Wildlife is now reviewing that report, but it should be out pretty soon.
So Brian, I know that you've done a lot of work with the MPAs and also looking at the MPA networks. Can you tell us why those networks are important and the benefits of MPAs?
Yeah, MPAs are a really important conservation tool in the marine science. Not the only one, but certainly one that is proven over and over through literally hundreds of studies across the world that if you close an area and you allow the stocks to build up, they have benefits that you don't normally see. One is we have a picture of what the ocean looks like without human impacts, which tells us what the world should look like. And that's really important. But secondly, it also actually helps seed areas outside of it. And that basically is like having money in the bank. You leave the principal in a marine protected area, but the interest flows out and you can spend that all you want. So it's a great way of promoting sustainable fisheries. It protects habitat. It protects important areas that we really value, things like Point Lobos, Cape Mendocino, a lot of the Channel Islands. And they've been shown through many studies almost everywhere to be quite effective.
And some of the most successful of these marine protected areas are bottom up, where fishermen in the Philippines and Puerto Rico and even Port Orford, Oregon, initiated the process, recognized that they were losing what they had before and that this was one tool to protect them.
Yeah, well, in fact, one of the MPA's Redfish Rocks in Oregon was initiated by the city Port Orford and the fishermen there. They really wanted to see if this would work, and they're still studying it. We'll see. It's only been about 8 years, and rockfish grow pretty slow, but very supportive. Hawaii was like that too. People really wanted these marine protected areas to kind of push the ornamental trade away from some of the conflict with swimmers and dive tourism and things like that. And so we came in and, in a public meeting, we had 99% of the testimony was positive, which is really rare for a marine protected area. So, yeah, you're right. When the community wants it, it's really effective. It helps a lot.
So as the oceans are changing rapidly today, do you find attitudes of the students at the marine labs are changing in terms of their sense of why they're going into this field or what they hope to achieve?
Absolutely. I mean, the students just this semester in my marine biology class are all so motivated to make a difference in the world, to go out and try to educate people about what's going on. I think that's the most important thing. A lot of people don't know about how people's actions can harm the ocean. Things like climate change and plastics and, just walking in the shore or taking things. And they're extremely motivated, and they have been for a while, but it's becoming more urgent. I can feel it. They really want to get out there and make a difference.
And an interesting way of communicating your science plus your love of surfing is science fiction. I read your book last year. It's a lot of fun. Why don't you talk about how you ended up writing a science fiction novel?
I started a blog, which was a way to not only kind of start reaching out in a way that was fun, and I really just enjoy writing, but also I realized it was helping me learn how to write non-science, which is what I spent my whole life. And that's a big change. So I decided, hey, let's try to reach the world in another way. And science fiction, of course, is popular. And the book is really about the environment and Earth. And it's used by looking at this parallel world that is just being contacted by humans and how we would treat that, which of course is not necessarily well. And it's telling us something about our own environmental consciousness, how we treat sentient life, which is encountered on that, and ultimately our values and what we need to change. And the focus is on a woman, a Hawaiian surfer called Sage, and her journey, because at first she doesn't care about anything, but she learns to love this planet and wants to protect it. So it's kind of a environmental consciousness journey that she takes, which I think all of us have taken at various points in our life. And I'm just trying to model that so people can have some idea of why that's important, and what the consequence of that is.
Well, Sage wants sponsors, and you've got an ocean planet with rideable 100-foot waves, so it's a good start, and I can see where your background informed it.
Yeah, the surfing was really kind of a hook to get in there, but it's also kind of a metaphor for trying to conquer the unconquerable. Nobody can conquer the ocean, right? It's no matter who people are, we realize how limitless it is and how we throw ourselves against it. We just have to respect it and live with it. And that's what she ultimately learns. But the book also has a lot of science. I mean, I read over 100 papers, astronomy, geology, paleontology, oceanography, and, try to thread that in an interesting way. People are not only having fun, as you say, reading about surfing and this journey, but also learning a little bit about, exobiology and what life could be like on other planets.
I kind of like this planet and really want to do the best we can to keep it
Absolutely.
healthy and improve it.
So your labs and your work, you've looked at the state of coral reefs, kelp forest, fisheries, particularly with bottom trolling. What are the areas that you see emerging in terms of work for the marine labs and marine science?
Well, as you probably know, there's an awful lot of research on climate change and its related issues. So that's what a lot of what we're doing here in Trinidad and a lot of other labs, particularly ocean acidification. That's something that's not really well understood. The North Coast is a really great place to study that because we have very unique oceanography. So between Cape Mendocino and Cape Blanco in southern Oregon, we don't get continuous upwelling like Oregon does. We get this fluctuating upwelling. And when the upwelling happens, it brings in cold, high nutrient, deep ocean water, which is low in pH. So it's more acidic naturally. And so we are kind of seeing naturally on this coast what we might see in the future everywhere. So it's a great way to look at how organisms respond. We just finished a 3-year National Science Foundation funded study looking at the effects of ocean acidification. And what comes with that is low oxygen, kind of anoxia, and dead zones sometimes on juvenile rockfish. And found that really, they're pretty resilient to ocean acidification, but the fish were from the North Coast. They don't like the low oxygen, though. They can't do well at all. We actually put them in little tunnels, and we were swimming against the current. And just like a treadmill, we see how long they can swim, and then finally they get tired and give up, and they kind of lay on the ground and move around. This was all sublethal. It doesn't kill the fish, but it certainly changed their performance. And in the ocean, what that means is they wouldn't be able to escape predators or forage or reproduce nearly as effective. So we just don't know what all these things are going to do. That's the scariest part. And it's not just ocean acidification. It's also temperature. It's also sea level rise. There's a lot of complex things going on simultaneously. And so a lot of studies are trying to tease those things out where they look at 3 or 4 different stressors simultaneously. And one of the reasons I came here is not only it's not impacted by humans, and so we really can get some insights into what it looks like and compared to other places, which is, most of California is pretty highly populated, and we are very sparse, as you pointed out in your book, the Golden State. There's just not much up here, and that's great. I mean, Trinidad only has a population of 320 people, so yet it was incorporated in 1858 or something. It's really old. But we're right on the water. The fishermen are going out, and I really respect them because it's rough out there. It's huge, but yet the crab fisheries are a big part of, this coastline. And so what's really neat is to see a really tight relationship between the people in the community and the ocean. They've depended on it for many years for a variety of ways. And it's nice to see that kind of interaction. So there's a lot of respect for things up here, but there's also a long history of exploitative fisheries that have had impacts on the ocean. But now we have these marine protected areas, so everything has kind of shifted to talking about that. A big player in all of this are all the tribes that are up here on the coast. And, they're wonderful partners, and they have all sorts of traditional ecological knowledge that we're starting to infuse through Humboldt State and through some of the management agencies into modern practices. And that's something that's really unique up here as well. And fantastic people to work with, and a lot of really important issues that everybody's starting to look at together. And I think that's how we do it together.
So with that, I would like to thank you so much for joining us today on the Rising Tide Ocean Podcast. And thank you for all of your work and your insight. And I can't wait to read your book.
Well, thank you. It's been a huge honor to be with both of you today, and I really enjoyed talking with you.
Rising Tide is a production of Blue Frontier with host David Helvarg and support from Natasha Benjamin, Ellie Curlow, and myself, Vicki Nichols-Goldstein. Rising Tide's editing services and additional technical support are provided by Studio Cape May of San Diego, California. The theme song is written and performed by Ethan Kenbar. You can find Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast, at www.bluefront.org or download it anytime from Apple, Google, or Spotify.
Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free, the sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the blue frontier. Off in the salty ocean, off to the blue frontier.
Sparky, come here, buddy. Sparky! There you are. Good boy, Sparky.